Hello, and welcome to this video on aeronautical decision making and the process of making decisions to be safe in the airplane as you're flying, as well as making good decisions on the ground before you go fly. The main one deciding if you're actually going to step foot in that airplane and go take off into whatever scenario lies ahead that day. So let's take a step back. Aeronautical decision making has to do with making proper decisions, taking into account all the factors leading into a flight, and making decisions to mitigate risk and promote safety. So we want to always be safe in our decision making because aviation itself comes with a few inherent risks. Number one, we're flying up in the sky. A lot of things have the possibility to go wrong, but as long as we take the correct precautions and preparation, then we'll be able to mitigate those risks to a really small, insignificant amount. And that way, even if something does come up, we'll be prepared and ready to handle it as it comes to the forefront. So, as we're getting ready to make decisions, the first checklist that comes to my mind when I plan to decide if I'm going to go fly that day is the Pave Checklist. This starts out with P for pilot, A for aircraft, V for environment, and E for external pressures associated with the flight. So let's start off with the P for pilot. So we can tie this into a lot of different aspects of the pilot. Number one, are we current as a pilot? This means have we met the legal minimum requirement to in order to act legally as the pilot on this specific flight that we're trying to do. For this scenario, let's take an IFR flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles. Let's hypothetically say that's our scenario. We're planning to leave at night and we'll be carrying a passenger along with us who wants to come along for the ride. Not a paying passenger, just someone coming along for the ride. So, as we prepare to take this flight, we want to take into account a few things. So, for currency, we'd want to make sure that for one, we need our flight review every 24 months. Then we also need our passenger currency since we're taking a passenger. And since the flight is at night, those three takeoffs and landings in the same category and class in the preceding 90 days have to be done to a full stop landing. So, as we do that, then we can move into the last bit, which is our instrument currency. Since we're going to fly this flight under instrument flight rules, we want to make sure we're instrument current, which means in the previous 6 calendar months, we need to have done 6 instrument approaches, holding procedures, and intercepting and tracking navigational systems. The last few requirements, that intercepting and tracking navigational systems, usually occurs anytime you are doing a hold or an instrument approach because you are usually intercepting a course and using some kind of navigational system, whether it be a VOR, a GPS, an ILS localizer, any kind of nav aid that provides navigation. So if we're intercepting those courses, we satisfy that requirement, and we just really need to do the 6 approaches and holding in the previous 6 months. So if we've done that as a pilot, we've met the bare minimum bar that the FAA sets. Now, for me personally, I like to do 12 approaches in the previous 6 months if I'm going to fly IFR with a passenger, especially if it's going to be into actual instrument meteorological conditions. So there's a difference for me between flying IFR in VMC conditions or visual meteorological conditions under IFR, but we're still able to see outside, as opposed to being IFR and actually in the clouds or in actual instrument conditions. So, as we're doing that, we'd want to look ahead at the weather. So, we talked about this in our weather video, so I'm not going to go through a whole lot with weather right now. But looking at the icing conditions, if there's IMC, the chances of icing are usually pretty significant at some level. Eventually, you will reach the freezing level, and if there's clouds in the freezing level, that's usually pretty prone to icing. You would also want to look at your turbulence, any kind of airmet, sigmet, convective sigmet, any sort of major weather that's going to cause issues en route or getting to and from your location of departure to your arrival or destination. Once you kind of looked at the weather after you determined your current, that's the first couple things you want to do. Then you want to determine, am I safe? So, like I mentioned before, if you have those bare minimum currency requirements, that's the bare minimum. So, my personal minimum is 12 approaches in the previous 6 months. If you're someone who's a little less proficient at doing instrument stuff, then you might want to increase it to say 20 approaches in the previous 6 months or something that fits for you. And these are known as personal minimums, which is a really important part of making decisions. Because if you're outside of your personal minimums, then chances are you're going to be kind of uncomfortable flying in that flight, and you're not going to be able to make sound, accurate, and well judged and thought out decisions. This is going to affect how well you're able to perform and therefore could affect the safety outcome of the flight. So you don't want any kind of safety outcome to be determined by your personal minimums because you want to know that you're comfortable in the conditions that you're put into while you're in the air. It's a lot better to be on the ground wishing you flew that day if the weather happens to get better, as opposed to being in the air as the weather is deteriorating and you're kind of getting stressed out and looking for options and time is running out before you run into trouble. It's a lot easier to walk home if you're already on the ground versus walk home from the air when you have to descend through a cloud layer that you weren't prepared to do. So always look ahead. Next up with that is going to be your proficiency. So that kind of ties into how safe are you as a pilot. You can be proficient without being legally current. That happens sometimes if you don't actually log the currency requirements, then you're not legally current. Even if you do 50 approaches, if you don't log any of them and 6 months go by, you're not legally current. So that's an example of where you could be proficient or higher above the safety margin than the legal minimum, but still not be actually legally current to do the flight. So both are really important to have. Both are really important aspects, and you want to make sure that you're taking off on a trip. You are both proficient and current. So you're legal and safe to do that trip. The next aspect to a pilot that I like to tie in is your documents. So you want to make sure you have all your documents that are required, your government ID, your medical, and your pilot certificate. So if you have all these, then that takes care of your documents. So good job. And the other things that you might want to consider are part of what's known as the I'm safe checklist. So this has to deal with risk mitigation in regards to keeping the pilot safe and helping them determine whether or not they are safe to fly that day. So let's go through this. I'm safe stands for illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion slash eating. The last one, people tend to use both. My rule is you can't be happy if you haven't eaten. So otherwise, you're hangry. You don't want to be hangry as you're flying around in a plane, especially carrying someone and putting their life in your hands as you're the one flying the aircraft. So let's take it back. So illness is the first one. So you obviously wouldn't want to be sick and be flying. This could deteriorate your judgment ability, mental capacity, anything relating to how you are able to soundly make decisions and judgments in the cockpit. The next thing would be medicine. So, this is a pretty strict rule regarding pilots. Anytime you are on a medication, before you go fly while taking that medication, you want to verify that it is okay to do so with your AME or Airman Medical Examiner. They're the ones that issue your medical, and they'll have a good understanding of the rules and regulations pertaining to medications. And they'll be able to advise you of any kind of wait period that you'd have to do after taking a certain medication, or if it's perfectly fine to go fly after taking whatever medication it is. You don't want to rely on any kind of online posts, blogs, lists. These could not be accurate, and possibly could cost you your career or any kind of aviation hopes if you end up flying while taking a medication when you're not supposed to. That's a really big thing that you do not want to get yourself involved in. You want to make sure you're safe in that regard. So always double check if you're taking a medication, contact your AME. Next up is going to be stress. So there's two basic kinds of stress. You got acute and chronic. Acute is going to be something over a short period of time that's probably just going to last a very minute period. It'll be something that you could probably pretty easily get over on your own, as opposed to chronic, it'll be extended over a long period of time. Let's say you have something coming up in the future that's constantly going to be stressing you out for the next 3, 4, 5 weeks, possibly months at a time. Let's say you had someone pass away in your family. That could, depending on who it was, be a chronic stress or an acute stress. If it's someone maybe you weren't super close to, maybe it's an acute stress as you go to their funeral. And then that stress would then go away possibly after you leave. If it's your parent or someone really close to you, that stress could last a lot longer, which leads to chronic stress. Next comes alcohol. So this deals with the alcohol rules pertaining to flying. I hope this goes without saying, but to be safe in an aircraft, you definitely should not be drinking alcohol or be under any kind of influence of drugs while operating a aircraft. This is something, again, just like the medication, that you really don't want to get yourself involved on the wrong side of it, because if you do, it could really hinder you in being able to reach any kind of aviation goal that you do have. So the rules for alcohol is going to be 8 hours from drinking to in the plane or aircraft. That's minimum hard cut, not even 7 hours and 59 minutes. 8 hours is the minimum. And the next thing would be a 0.04% blood alcohol content. So if it is 0.04 when they test you, then that is actually illegal. So you have to be below that. In my personal opinion, for my personal minimum, I don't drink anything within 36 hours of flying if I'm going to drink. And that's a common thing I know amongst other people. It's a good wait period, and you really want to make sure, because the next part of it is that you cannot be under any influence of alcohol or drugs. So if you're hungover from the night before, that would not be good and therefore break the regulation and could get you a citation on your certificate with a deviation. So you do not want that. Next step is going to be the fatigue. So, kind of like stress, there's the two kinds, acute and chronic. So, you can kind of imagine acute fatigue, maybe you didn't sleep one night too well. You could fix that by sleeping the next night and catch yourself up, and you'll be good to go. The chronic aspect is if maybe you're not getting any sleep for multiple nights in a row, that could cause an issue, and probably you'd want to seek help for maybe if you end up having sleep apnea or anything like that to make yourself have trouble sleeping. You don't want to have trouble sleeping because it's going to lead to being tired, and being tired leads to making bad decisions because you're not at your full mental capacity. The next thing, like I mentioned before, is you don't want to be hangry. So you want to have good emotion and you want to be eating. If you're going to do a few flights in a day, or this one flight in particular, it's a pretty long flight from Phoenix to LA, especially in a training aircraft. So you want to make sure that you ate something before you left. And this includes hydrating, especially in Arizona and the surrounding areas where it gets really hot in the summer. You want to make sure you're hydrated because dehydration can set in fast, and that obviously can take away from your mental capacity to perform. So that's the I'm safe checklist. So you kind of want to go through that and make sure that you fall into the safe category on all those aspects. Therefore, not being sick, not taking any medication that you can't, and not being too stressed, not breaking or anywhere close to the alcohol limits, not being fatigued, and having good emotional health and eating. So that takes you through the I'm safe checklist. Once we get through that, that kind of covers the majority of what I take into account for the pilot. The next amount of risk comes with the aircraft. So that's the next letter in the Pave checklist, the A. So the things that you want to check for the aircraft is going to be the die checklist I like to use, because if you don't use it, then you might die. So we're going to check the documents, the inspections, and the equipment. So the documents is going to be EAROCP. That stands for external data plate, airworthiness, registration, radio license if you're going outside of the US, and your operator manual or POH with the weight and balance inside that, the current one, and then your compass deviation card and any placards associated with the aircraft need to be on board and installed where they belong. Then we can move into the inspections. So, an acronym people like to use, and you can check it out on my acronym page, is AVIATE. So, you got your annual, your VOR, your 100-hour, your altimeter, transponder, ELT, and static encoder. So your annual is going to be due every 12 calendar months. Your 100-hour is going to be due every 100 hours. Your VOR is going to be due every 30 days if you're using VORs for IFR. Then you're also going to need your altimeter every 24 months, as well as your transponder. Your altimeter is needed for IFR operations. Your transponder is needed when you need a transponder. In the section, it goes over when you need a transponder on the regulation section pertaining to 91.215. That's the transponder requirements. So you're able to check that. There's the inspections. So as long as the aircraft has the inspections written out in the maintenance log, as well as complying with all of the ADs and any other inspections that are required for that particular aircraft. So once you check the inspections, the next thing is going to be the required equipment. So this we have in our acronym section as well. There's equipment required for VFR day in 91205 Part Bravo, and then you have night equipment. So that would be needed on our IFR night flight I was talking about, which would be in 91205 Part Charlie. And then you also have your IFR required equipment, which you would also need on top of the other two for our flight since we're going to be IFR. And that would be in 91205 Part Delta. So combining all of those together, that would be your required equipment as well as any equipment required per the operator's manual or the manufacturer requirements. You'd want to be able to check that and make sure that you fit into everything necessary. The other part of equipment is making sure that if there's any inoperative equipment that you follow the correct procedure and that you can still fly with it. This procedure would be outlined in 91.213, and it really depends mostly on whether or not you're operating with or without a minimum equipment list. So that we could leave up to you, and you could work your way through with or without using the correct process outlined in 91.213, determining what your process should be. Now that we tackled the aircraft, hopefully the aircraft is in airworthy condition after doing that, and then the aircraft is hopefully safe. So we can check that off our list. Next, we're going to go ahead and look at the environment. So what I like to use for this is the acronym New Craft. This pertains to Part 91.103 for pre-flight action. This is everything you need to check before you go fly. So that's kind of what we're doing right now. It says that you need to check for any NOTAMs, notices to airmen. You need to get all the available information. So I like to use E for everything, kind of just all encompassing relative to your flight. Then you need your known ATC delays, your runway lengths of the runways that you're going to be operating on, your alternatives, which are different than alternates. So an alternative just means a separate plan that you can go to as a backup if your original plan cannot be carried out as planned. So, as we move into that, then after alternatives would be your fuel requirements. So, you'd have to know how much fuel you need, and you would want to make sure that you take off with that correct amount of fuel at a minimum. Then for the last part would be T for your takeoff and landing distance calculations. So you need to know that you can take off and land in the runway distances that you have available to you. It seems like it would be pretty obvious stuff, but a lot of people slip through the cracks, and this is how a lot of accidents occur. Many accidents are from people trying to take off on a runway that they really didn't have the performance at that time to get off of. And this could be totally avoidable if they calculate their takeoff and landing distance performance calculations. So that takes care of most of the environment. Some other things to consider would be your terrain, if you need oxygen on board, depending on your altitude, how far you're going, what's the weather, all that stuff. So everything in that encompasses the environment. So next, we're going to go ahead and get to our last letter of the PAVE checklist, the E. So this is going to be external pressures. So for this, I like to throw in hazardous attitudes. So the hazardous attitudes are going to be macho, impulsivity, invulnerability, resignation, and anti-authority. These five things are things the FAA has come up with, saying that these attitudes are prevalent in pilots and could possibly lead to dangerous and misjudged behavior. You want to know what kind of hazardous attitude you experience from time to time. That way, you can learn how to compensate for it and hopefully protect yourself from going too far down the road of trouble. Once you figure all that out, the other main external pressure I like to throw in, especially since in our scenario we have a passenger, is a get there itis scenario. This is where maybe the passenger is trying to pressure you to take them because they need to get there for whatever reason. Let's say they have a conference or a meeting the next morning and you're trying to leave that night to get there in the morning. They could be pressuring you even though you might not think it's a good idea, and you don't want to be succumb to that pressure and do the flight when you don't feel comfortable, because in the end, if something happens, they're going to look to you to get the aircraft safely on the ground. So if you don't feel safe to go fly, don't let anybody ever tell you to go fly. That's not a good way to be a pilot in command. And being a pilot in command is one of the most important things of being a pilot, because if you're not commanding the aircraft and you're the pilot, I don't really know who is. And that's a really bad question to be asking in the cockpit. You want to be the one flying the airplane and making the decisions, not some flimsy air molecule that's floating around the air. You want to be the one deciding what is happening to that plane and what is going to happen to that plane next. So the next aspect I'm going to go into is kind of more along the lines of situational awareness and broadened out decision making. So I'm going to first start out with defining situational awareness as knowing everything around you and what is coming next in your current status. So if I am flying and about to enter a traffic pattern or enter an approach, I'll know the next few fixes along the approach, what's coming next, what are my altitudes, and I'll know everything around where I am currently and what's coming next. So that's being situationally aware. It's important to have situational awareness. That way you can stay ahead of where the plane is, because if the plane arrives there first, you're just going along for the ride. And like I said, you want to be the one controlling the plane. You never want the plane controlling you. So as you're thinking about making decisions, there's a model or two that you can use to help analyze how your mind thinks about decisions. So there's two models that come to mind. There's the 3P model, and then there's also the decide model. So we'll go ahead and start with the 3P model, where it's perceive, process, and perform. You're going to want to make sure that you perceive anything around you. That's situational awareness we're talking about. So let's say all of a sudden a plane is coming head on at you. You'd want to perceive that. So maybe you see them, maybe you have them on your ADSB in on your traffic screen. You're perceiving them when you notice that they are coming at you. The next thing is going to be processing it. So you'd want to process and think about what to do about it. That's kind of processing the information, gathering different solutions. Then at the end, you're going to want to perform one of the solutions that you thought would be the best. Let's say if they're coming right at you, I'm going to probably want to turn. I'm not going to want to continue right at another aircraft. That's not usually going to be the right decision. So we'll turn and then we will, as part of the perform, we'll evaluate to see if what we did to perform that task actually worked at getting rid of whatever we perceive to be an issue. So if we turn and then we're not on collision course with the other aircraft anymore, then good, we solved our problem. Taking the same example and using the decide model, we're going to detect the issue. So we're going to detect that aircraft again, kind of like the perceive section of the 3P model. Then we are going to estimate the severity. So I'd say an aircraft coming right at me in the air is probably something I'd want to react to. It's not something I'd want to just let slide. So it's pretty severe, it needs action to correct it. Then we are going to choose a desirable outcome. In this case, I'm going to choose to not want to hit the other aircraft. I think that's probably the desirable outcome in this sense. You don't want to hit the other aircraft. Then we are going to identify multiple solutions. So we could say we could climb, turn, descend, do a 180, 360 climbing turn. We could do a multitude of things. And we're going to do then one of them. So that's the do. So the next D is do. So we're just going to do one of those solutions. And then E, we're going to evaluate to see if what we did worked. If it didn't, then we'll go back to identify and do another solution that we came up with. And we'll keep repeating that until we do something that passes the evaluation stage as solving our problem. That's how you efficiently use the decide model and the 3P model to make decisions and mitigate risks in the aircraft. Next, we'll talk a little bit about, for the next few minutes, how to really decide whether or not it's a safe idea to go. There's a checklist on the FAA website called the Pave Personal Minimum Checklist. I'll go ahead and pull it up for you guys so you're able to see it. And that way you can understand what it is that we are looking at when we talk about our personal minimums and making our decision of whether or not to go. So we're going to go ahead here and look at this page, and it'll show how much of what we're doing is important. So here is the Pave checklist. So you can see here we got pilot, aircraft, environment, external pressures. It talks you through how to do this checklist, and it lists out all these personal minimums that you can have, which is a great thing to have because if it's written down, it's solid and it's firm and it's not going to change without significant thought on your end in a non-pressure situation. This way, if someone questions you, you can say, hey, this is my minimum. I have it written down. This is what I'm going to follow for myself in order to keep me and you safe during our planned flight. And you could use that to help you decide yes or no on your go or no go decision. So this is a really good tool. I love using this. I suggest all my students use this in helping them decide whether or not they should go on a flight. So that concludes the end of our risk management aeronautical decision making video. If you have any questions, please reach out, send me a message, and I'll be happy to answer, give any suggestions I can. And good luck to you in your flight training, and thank you.